Which way blow the political winds in Northern Ireland? The Centennial of the decision to remain in the United Kingdom overshadowed this past week by the infighting within the Democratic Unionist Party of the now outgoing First Minister Arlene Foster. Pushed out by her own rank and file, we'll ask if that signals a further tack to the right for the Christian fundamentalist pro-Brexit DUP, which opposed Theresa May's trade deal, but which, with Boris Johnson, now finds itself with a trade border in the Irish Sea. Brexit's unintended consequences include a spike in sectarian tension, with recently the worst rioting seen in years. More than 2 decades after the Good Friday agreements, why is there still that sectarian tension? For that matter, some of Europe's worst poverty on both sides of the divide in places like Belfast. There's also strong evidence against a return to the state of near civil war that was known as the Troubles. A solid 56% of Northern Irish citizens voted to remain in the EU. That means Unionists and Republicans found themselves often on the same side. Is their cause best served by sticking with Britain or a unification referendum with Dublin? Today in the France 24 debate, we are looking at the perhaps what is the changing of the guard and certainly the upending of the status quo in Northern Ireland. With us, he advised the First Minister of Northern Ireland after the 1998 Good Friday Accords, economist Graham Gudgeon, Research Associate at Cambridge University. Welcome back to the France 24 debate.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
From Belfast, historian Brian Feeney, who's a columnist with the daily newspaper The Irish News. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And we say hello to Élodie Favre, who is a lecturer in political science and international affairs at Queen's University in Belfast. Nice to see you.
Good evening.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Before we talk about the present, Brian Feeney, can you just remind our viewers what happened 100 years ago? Why are there 2 Irelands to begin with?
100 years ago, the British government decided that the only way to resolve the problem of whether or not there should be home rule or some kind of independent Ireland was to partition the island, because in the northeast of the island, a substantial proportion of the population, particularly the greater Belfast area, counties Antrim and Down, were absolutely adamant that they would not accept any kind of home rule. They would not be governed from Dublin. They believed that it would break the economic link with Britain. The biggest shipyard in the world was in Belfast at the time, and a lot of other enormous economic enterprises. So they resolved to fight rather than accept home rule. And in the course of a number of years, the British government decided that the best thing to do was to partition the island, and that the 6 northeastern counties would remain part of the United Kingdom. And the Government of Ireland Act, which partitioned the island, came into force exactly 100 years ago on Monday. And that really is the short version of why they decided to partition the island.
Is it an event that's been... I was going to ask you, is it an event that's been marked? Is it something that's being talked about?
Well, I mean, there is a great polarisation here, and the nationalist community refuses to acknowledge any kind of commemoration or celebration of the centenary. The various bodies that the British government set up to recognise the centenary, they were all boycotted by the main nationalist parties, Sinn Féin and the SDLP. Whereas on the Unionist side, they do want to celebrate and commemorate the centenary. The problem is the pandemic makes it pretty well impossible to have any kind of marches or demonstrations or substantial gatherings. Later on in the year, there may be some kind of demonstrations to celebrate, but at the moment, the pandemic restrictions prevent that happening.
And that brings us to, of course, today's events, which are kind of overshadowing these commemorations. We're talking about Arlene Foster, a woman who you might say had the whole world in her hands back in 2017. In the thick of Brexit negotiations, her DUP, with its 10 seats at Westminster, held the balance of power. That's because UK Prime Minister Theresa May had called a snap election where she actually lost votes. So she needed the votes of the DUP in order to govern. And when Boris Johnson, 2 years later, wins in a landslide, the DUP suddenly, seems a little more expendable to the Tories back at Westminster. Fast forward to last week and a resignation speech that was a mix of largesse and bitterness.
The protocol being foisted upon Northern Ireland against the will of unionists has served to destabilise Northern Ireland in more recent times. And whilst there is still a job of work to do, I am proud that there is a young generation of Democratic Unionists getting involved in politics and trying to shape Northern Ireland for the better.
So she's angry about the post-Brexit protocol, Graham Goodgen. Do you share that anger?
Well, I think the protocol has been very badly handled and is causing great problems. I mean, it's causing the serious social disruption that it was meant to avoid. And it is leading to a diversion of trade, which again, the protocol itself says it doesn't want to do. So I'm not sure if anger is the right emotion here, but it's certainly something that all unionists oppose. And it'll either be watered down, I think, through the current negotiations which are going on with Brussels, or it might be suspended altogether. But it's certainly a big problem, and that's the real reason for Arlene Foster's demise.
Did Arlene Foster miss a chance, perhaps, when she had that sway when you had a minority government under Theresa May? Could she have done better in negotiating a better deal?
Yes, probably to some extent, but not hugely. The DUP, I think, made a big mistake in going for money. They got about £2 billion extra for Northern Ireland instead of maximising their influence. And now I think they're having to pay for that mistake.
What could they have done?
Actually, if you look at the numbers, not a great deal actually. But I think they kept their heads down too much. You know, they didn't put enough pressure on the government of Theresa May at that point. They could have been more, could have made more fuss. But in a sense, they were paid off and they were bought off. But whether it really would have made any difference is difficult to say. They only had 10 MPs, and that probably wasn't enough to make a huge difference.
And now Arlene Foster is out. Elodie Favre, why is Arlene Foster out? Explain it to us.
Hi. Well, you've mentioned some of the factors, and the dominant factor is indeed the protocol and some of the unhappiness with the protocol inside the party as well. And so there are tensions to a degree between some people who think really there should not be any form of implementation of the protocol, and really putting some clear red lines in terms of refusing to build border posts in Belfast and London Harbour, and also refusing to participate in North-South cooperation. Whereas once the DUP is in government, as Arlene Foster is, she's also in a position where she needs to implement the law of the land, which means that she and Edwin Poots as Minister for Agriculture is responsible for the infrastructure that is being built, etc. So that's the dominant issue. There's a secondary issue around social conservatism.
That's an issue that you can't resolve whoever's in charge then, because the DUP is fundamentally against the power sharing agreement, and yet they have to implement it.
The DUP are now in favour of power sharing in Northern Ireland. They're no longer in opposition to power sharing as they were at the time of the Good Friday Agreement. So The question is whether they will threaten to collapse the institutions in order to get the removal of the Northern Ireland Protocol that they so dislike. But support for the union in its breadth is also largely dependent on the functioning of the devolved institutions. So that's a bit of a gamble for them. That would be a gamble.
Brian Feeney, you wrote a column about this for the Irish News in which you talked about the fact that the DUP didn't see coming the dangers that Brexit had in lie for them.
That's right. Like the extreme Brexiteers in Britain, the DUP lived in a fantasy world that there was going to be a wonderful city on the top of a sunny hill after Brexit, a defiance of all logic and all the facts. They didn't realise the very fundamental point that if you're going to leave the customs union and the single market of the EU, there has to be a border. And the EU had already been absolutely explicit that the border would not be on the island of Ireland. So if you're leaving the customs union and the single market, that border is going to have to be in the Irish Sea. And it's going to have to be between the Great Britain and the north of Ireland. And that's what the protocol says. Now, Theresa May didn't have the majority to do that, but Boris Johnson has a majority of 80. And he can simply disregard the position of the DUP. And his slogan was to get Brexit done. And he was just determined to do that. And he literally threw the DUP overboard. But they resisted from 2016 right through really from 2017 when they held the balance of power. They resisted all attempts by Theresa May to try to mitigate the impact of leaving the customs union and the single market. And her attempts were frustrated. The DUP refused to vote for anything because they just did not see the inevitability that the border was going to have to be in the Irish Sea. And the problem they face is that the Irish Protocol is an arrangement, an international arrangement between the EU and the UK. And they can stamp up and down all the streets they want. They can have demonstrations. They can do what they like. They will not be able to get rid of the protocol. It's as simple as that. It can be mitigated. There can be tweaks. There are various committees at the moment who are trying to work out how they can arrange certain tweaks. But the protocol will not go. And even if they manage to get some kind of vote through in 2024, it would have to be replaced by another protocol. And at the moment, what the DUP and unionists in general are doing is wildly overplaying the dangers of the protocol. In actual fact, the protocol offers the best of both worlds to business in the north of Ireland, where they can trade into the EU in the Republic and trade into Great Britain. There are difficulties, mainly because Britain, because of the hard Brexit treaty they negotiated, they will not align their sanitary conditions, the fight of the plant and animal conditions with the EU arrangements. So because they won't do that, then everything coming in that plant and animal produce has to be inspected. Now, at the moment, Britain and the EU Commission are trying to negotiate various ways to deal with this, such as moving guide dogs and horses and so on. But this is just working around the edges of the protocol. The protocol will not go. And Boris Johnson has made that absolutely clear. And he will just carry on ignoring this place. There are no votes in the north of Ireland for the Conservative Party. He has nothing to lose.
And that brings us to the fact that now there's a contest for the party leadership of the DUP, again, the largest party in Northern Ireland, so it will automatically, under the power-sharing agreement, get the First Minister's post. The front-runner for that party leadership, you heard Élodie Favre mention him, is Edwin Poots. He's currently Minister of Agriculture in Northern Ireland. He's calling for peace. He's calling for nonviolence. His social ideas, Graham Gudgeon, turning heads over here. He is somebody who stood against Arlene Foster on the issue of gay conversion therapy. He's a creationist who believes the planet is only 6,000 years old. How much will that seep into his politics, I know he may not himself be the First Minister, but when he becomes party leader?
Well, it may do to an extent, but the big social conservative battles on abortion and on gay marriage have already been largely settled. They won't be reversed. So I don't think Edwin Poots will make very much difference. But I think he's very bad news for Northern Ireland and for Northern Ireland Unionists, because Northern Ireland is regarded in Great Britain, across the UK, as a bit of an unusual and odd place. But with Edwin Poots in power, it will come to be regarded as really weird rather than odd. Just to explain to your viewers, about 1% of Northern Ireland Protestants are Free Presbyterians and religious fundamentalists, and although they're only 1%, they have come to dominate the DUP. Indeed, the DUP was really set up by people from that church, and at present perhaps just under half of their politicians in the Assembly are members of that church. But the problem is, and they know this, they know that's not representative of unionists in Northern Ireland, especially young unionists. And if the DUP is not to wither away, they know it has to become more liberal. Therefore, my instinct is that Edwin Poots in the end won't get it. He seems to be the front runner at present, but he has a very strong opponent in Geoffrey Donaldson, who's an MP in London, a unionist MP, and much more liberal, and I think will appeal much more to a wider unionist audience in electorate in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, will it be a more radical turn, or will it be a more moderate turn going forward? We're going to talk about it when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at how the Brexit effect on Northern Ireland is impacting a nation where 56% of the population voted Remain back in 2016 in that referendum. And now we've seen the First Minister ousted by her own party. What next for Northern Ireland, where the demographics are changing? And we're talking about it with Graham Gudgeon, research associate at Cambridge University, economist and former advisor to Northern Ireland's First Minister after the Good Friday Agreements, David Trimble. With us from Belfast, historian Brian Feeney, who's a columnist with daily newspaper The Irish News, and Élodie Favre, who is a lecturer in politics and international relations at Queen's University in Belfast. Welcome back to all of you. Of course, if there's more gridlock, and we had 3 years of the Northern Ireland Assembly not meeting over this past tenure, if there's more gridlock, there is the possibility of a snap election. Northern Ireland, where elections are theoretically expected exactly a year from now. What happens, though, if the vote happens sooner? The last time, the number of seats at Stormont was reduced. And so if you look at the chart, the big losers were the DUP and other unionist parties. They saw their representation fall, as you can see on this graph. The Sinn Féin, the Republican Party, it only lost 1 seat in that Northern Irish Assembly last time around. Élodie Favre, let me begin with you. At this point in time, do you see a snap election happening?
It's hard to say, really, because we really don't know who's going to be the leader of the DUP. I can imagine that, considering we're still only coming out of COVID restrictions, the British government might just want to keep this going until May of next year. It's really a snap election would probably be a decision that would not be taken rashly, I think.
All right, so you're saying that they'll probably hold off. You agree, Brian Feeney?
Yes, I do. I think it's not in the interest of either the DUP or Sinn Féin to have a snap election. And they both have a lot at stake in a an assembly election next year. And they also know that if you pull down the assembly, you're going to be blamed for doing that. And in the past, the parties that were perceived to have been the most intransigent were punished by the voters, mainly in that respect, the DUP, because a lot of their younger, more liberal supporters have moved to the Alliance Party. The DUP have been losing votes to the Alliance Party since 2017. Sinn Féin don't want to have an assembly election because their aim is to become First Minister next year, to become the largest party. And their ultimate goal in the next 2 or 3 years is that Sinn Féin would have First Minister in the Northern Ireland Assembly, and that Mary Lou McDonald, the leader of Sinn Féin, would be Taoiseach in the Republic. They really want by 2024-25 to be in that position. But if you pull the Assembly down, there's absolutely no chance of that happening. So it's not in their interest to do that. And they would be afraid if they did pull down the Assembly that they'd be punished and they would lose out to either the DUP or the Ulster Unionists, who would gain more votes as a result of Sinn Féin losing votes. So I don't think it's in the interest of either of the two main blocs to pull the Assembly down. It very much depends, though, as a colleague was saying there, that if Edwin Poots is elected, he will not be, he doesn't want to be First Minister, but he's talking about appointing all sorts of strange figures as First Minister, some of whom would horrify Sinn Féin and the nationalist community. And in that case, there may be political instability.
All right, political instability perhaps, and perhaps a snap election. Concomitant, there's another vote that may happen at some point in the near future. In the north, the gap between those who want to remain in the UK and those who want unification with Dublin has narrowed over time. To mark the centenary of Northern Ireland, the Irish Independent newspaper commissioning a poll that shows how in the north there's still a 9-point spread in favour of staying in the UK. But beware of the 2/3 south of the border who are in favour of unity. They're not ready, it seems, to follow the lead of, say, West Germany in 1990 when it absorbed the East. In the Republic, 54% say they would be unwilling to pay more tax to fund a united Ireland. Just 22% say they would pay more. So that shows you that the devil is in the detail sometimes with these polls. All that said, Graham Goodgen, I know that in the Good Friday agreements there's that possibility, if ever London feels as though there's a majority for it, of a referendum on unity. If the census next year shows that unionists are in the minority, do you see it happening?
No, I don't. I don't think we'll have a border poll, for a very long time. I don't think the census will show a majority, partly because of what's happening in the schools, in the primary schools, and partly because it's very hard to know who's a Catholic these days because of declining church membership, and of course the growth of people who say they're neither Protestant nor Catholic. The polls in Northern Ireland are also very difficult to interpret. Some polls say that support for a united Ireland in Northern Ireland is over 40%. Others say it's much closer to 20%. And my view is that the latter, the polls that say that under a quarter of people in Northern Ireland support a united Ireland, are the more careful research-based polls done from the universities.
And on that score, let me just ask you, on that score, you heard Brian Feeney mention, and this is fact, because this is what happened at the ballot box, the more moderate Renew Party has been gaining strength. What does that tell you?
I don't know. It's the Alliance Party, the sort of liberal between party that's been gaining votes. The DUP did very well in 2017. In fact, it got its highest ever poll. It did a bit less well in 2019 election, but it was still close to its second highest vote. The trouble for unionists now is whether there's going to be a split vote. If if the unionist vote is split between too many different unionist parties, that may well let Sinn Féin in. But the unionist parties know this, and really they're going to have to focus on this question before the next election, which I agree with the two other speakers here will probably not come until next year. I don't think there'll be a flash election, a quick election.
Not until next year. On Thursday, it'll be Scotland's turn to vote in elections that the nationalist SNP is slated to win. But its leader, Nicola Sturgeon, says that because of COVID, a second independence referendum is not on the agenda for now. So, Élodie Favre, this talk about the United Kingdom breaking up, has that been exaggerated?
Well, maybe it's really been a big issue since Brexit, in particular, that those further calls for a second referendum. Nicola Sturgeon suddenly also seeming to shift a little bit her position on a second independence referendum, even though if you look 6 months ago, that looks like it was going to be really the big issue of this election. However, she's also seeing that over the last 6 months, her lead in opinion polls has been going down, and therefore she may be retreating a little bit from that position of a second referendum is the dominant issue that we need to address now. And so maybe that's not as big an issue. It's still a very big issue in Scotland, and we'll have to see how the SNP plus the Scottish Green and Salmon's new party, Alba, do all together. But the SNP on its own looks like their lead is decreasing. Whereas in Northern Ireland, I would agree with the two colleagues that we're yet to see where we are in terms. We're quite some way away from a border poll, probably. The poll that you were showing also did not include people who don't know, which is sometimes a big issue here and tends to inflate the numbers for both Remain in the UK and United Ireland. Because typically 1 in 5, 1 in 4 people in a survey say they don't know how they would vote yet.
Because Élodie, we saw a month ago, before the death of Prince Philip, those clashes that took place in Belfast and elsewhere, sectarian violence that was reminiscent of the bad old days. But do you get the sense, sitting where you are in Belfast, that that Northern Ireland is becoming more radicalized or more moderate?
Overall, I think you could see through the last few elections have shown the SDLP picking up a little bit on the nationalist side, but also the increasing vote for alliance suggests that there is more moderation in Northern Ireland rather than further polarization. So, of course, you've got people who are very unhappy with the current status quo, whether that's the loyalists who've been demonstrating and some small numbers rioting last month, or at the other end, some so-called dissident Republicans who are causing some troubles in also some parts of the island here. But that's really small minorities. Most people want to get along with their life, keep doing what they're doing. They know the difference between how things are now and how they were during the Troubles, and they want politicians to find some sort of agreement on all the issues so that devolution keeps working and they can keep going on with their life.
Brian Feeney, so much has happened since 1998 and the signing of the Good Friday agreements. And yet, when we saw those clashes last month, I mean, the images from places like Shankill Road on one side, the Falls Road on the other, those neighborhoods, they haven't changed much, it seems, since before the Good Friday agreements. You still have this abject poverty in a lot of these places. Why is it still like that?
Well, the reason it's like that is because of the failure of the Northern Ireland executive to do anything about the abject poverty. But it's also because the fact that the north of Ireland has always, really since the Second World War, has been the poorest region in the UK. The UK doesn't have a regional economic policy where they can pour money into a particular part of the country. These areas have been neglected. The education system doesn't serve them well. the employment situation has changed dramatically, where it used to be heavy industry, it used to be textiles. All that is gone now, and it has never been successfully replaced with anything which can deal with these people who are coming out of school with no qualifications in the areas that you mentioned in particular, in West Belfast, but also in Derry and parts of North Belfast. There are large numbers of children leave school with no qualifications whatsoever. And the Northern Ireland Executive never devised a policy to deal with the abject poverty and the continuing poverty in those areas. But at the same time, you need to get those disturbances into perspective. Those were not serious disturbances. There was no gunfire. There was no heavy involvement of paramilitaries. Many of the people out rioting were children, 12, 13, 14 years old. And it also happened over a weekend. None of them was at school. But now that they're all back again at school. And it just hasn't been a heavily organised mass protest. And it was played up in the media because the pictures of fireworks and so on were spectacular. But it was nothing like the sort of trouble that happened 20, 25 years ago.
But Brian, you mentioned a failure. You mentioned a failure of the executive, and I have to ask you this question because on this show we've dealt in the past with the protests that have been going on in places like Lebanon, Iraq, where you have power sharing built into the rules. Is the problem the fact that you're always going to have, no matter what, with the Northern Ireland, with the Good Friday agreements, you always have power sharing and therefore a problem with accountability?
Well, it's not as simple as that. I mean, that tends to simplify the problem. One of the real difficulties here is that there is no real economic independence. The executive is actually, it's not a government, it's administration. It administers the money that comes from the UK. And they can't raise their own money. They don't have any real powers in taxation or anything else. But they simply look after each side. And it depends. Really, they operate in silos rather than together. They don't sit down, they can't agree on economic policy. They've repeatedly said that they want to establish an economic policy, and they talk about what they were going to do years ahead. But the last 5 years have been pretty disastrous because just at the time Brexit happened, the executive collapsed for 3 years. And, well, what do you expect after 3 years of no strategic economic government? The sort of poverty that we have in parts of Belfast and Derry is bound to be really a lot worse than it was.
You agree, Graham Gudgeon, that poverty, you can blame it on a failure of leadership in Belfast, but also on London?
No, I don't. I don't even believe that there is the poverty that Brian was referring to there. It's certainly not abject. Living standards in Northern Ireland are fairly close to the UK average. Unemployment, Northern Ireland has now got one of the lowest unemployment rates of the whole UK. Wages are rather lower, but then prices are low. It's much easier to buy a house in Northern Ireland, for instance, than it is where I live in Cambridge. Young people couldn't buy a house, but in Northern Ireland they...
16% of the population lives below the poverty line. Those are high numbers.
Yeah, but that's a relative concept. The poverty line is defined as 60% of the average. You know, you're always going to, a percentage of the population has always got to be below that. It's not absolute poverty. It's just a relative statistical measure. The problem in Northern Ireland isn't poverty. It is a problem of national identity. There are 1 million people in Northern Ireland who see themselves as British, and they want to remain British forever. And anything that threatens that, and the border in the Irish Sea is seen as a threat, anything that threatens that causes a great deal of trouble and upset. Brian's right. I think the degree of violence we saw a few weeks ago by Northern Ireland standards wasn't all that serious, but it may well get much more serious over the summer once the COVID lockdown finishes and once we get into what's called the marching season. So there may be a good deal more to come, but very little to do with poverty, in my view.
Élodie Favre, you agree?
About the
That it's about identity and not about economics?
Well, I think it may be changing a little bit. The more people we see stopping to vote either for a nationalist party or a unionist party are people who want to talk about something other than national identity. There are also recent polls that suggest, about 30% of the population of Northern Ireland identify as Northern Irish rather than exclusively British or exclusively Irish. Obviously, identity can be layered and multiple, but so you've got more and more people who would really like for politicians here to focus less on national identity and more on economics. But it's true that party competition and elections remain fundamentally about are you a unionist, are you a nationalist? But that vote for Alliance, vote for the Greens, shows people who want to focus on something other than the constitutional question.
Speaking of identity, there's a new president of the United States, and he squarely identifies as Irish American. He sent his Secretary of State this week to London. Let's listen.
The United States remains a steadfast supporter of a secure and prosperous Northern Ireland, in which all communities have a voice and can enjoy the gains of the hard-won peace. Like several U.S. presidents before him, President Biden has been unequivocal in his support for the Good Friday Agreement, which was a historic achievement and one that we should protect.
Brian Feeney, the fact that it's Joe Biden and not Donald Trump in the White House, does that change the calculus in Northern Ireland?
It certainly does. Nationalists are delighted that Joe Biden is the president, and he's appointed a number of Irish Americans to important positions in his administration. There's someone who's very sympathetic to Ireland, who's senior figure, Richie Neal, who's in charge of the Ways and Means Committee. So there's no chance of a trade agreement if there's any behaviour by the British government which damages the arrangements in the north of Ireland. And some people even go so far as to suggest that Boris Johnson held off serious decisions until he saw whether or not there was going to be a Republican President, Trump, re-elected. And then we saw it was Biden. He made his trade cooperation agreement with the EU and got Brexit done, so to speak. So there are a lot of people on the nationalist side who are very pleased that Biden is so explicit in supporting the Good Friday Agreement and indeed in supporting the Northern Irish Protocol. But everything here is seen in terms of one side or the other. Unionists do not appreciate the sort of statements that Joe Biden makes in the least. They regard him as completely biased. But nonetheless, he is a figure for stability and in many ways will actually keep the British government to the straight and narrow, because this particular government in the last 2 years has not shown itself to be trustworthy in any respect.
All right, that'll be the final word for now. Boris Johnson's not on our panel to answer that. Brian Feeney, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Belfast. I want to thank as well Graham Gudgeon and Elodie Favre. We want to thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.